Hello everyone, welcome back to Joy IELTS. Today we are breaking down an IELTS Writing Task 1, bar chart from Cambridge IELTS 17, step by step. I will walk you through a Band 9 sample essay, share powerful writing tips to boost your score, and stick around till the end for a synonym spotlight to level up your vocabulary. Let's get started. Stage 1. Reading the prompt and the graph. Step 1. Identifying key information. When I talk about key information, I mean the question type, the topic, the units, the time, the numbers, and the categories. Let's begin by reading the prompt and underlining the key details. The chart below gives information about how families in one country spent their weekly income in 1968 and 2018. This topic focuses on how family spending patterns have changed in 2 different years, both in the past. It's important to mark this to ensure we use the correct verb tense. We use past tense here. So, the topic and the time period are checked. Now let's move on to the chart type. In IELTS Writing Task 1, there are 2 common types of bar charts. Type 1. Bar charts that show data changing over time. Let's look at this example. Here, the x-axis represents time and the y-axis represents numbers. If we connect the highest point of each bar, we end up with a line graph. This type of bar chart is essentially the same as a line graph. If you are not sure how to approach line graph, make sure to check out my previous video on this topic. Type 2. Bar charts that compare numbers across different categories. Here is an example. In this case, the x-axis represents different categories, not time. Now, today's chart clearly falls into type 1. So, we've got the task type checked. Next, let's look at the instruction. Summarize information by selecting and reporting the main feature, and make comparisons where relevant. Our 2 main goals here are, first, select the important information. Second, compare where necessary. Step 2. Read the graph. First, let's start from the title. Title is the best source for your paraphrasing later on. Never skip it. Here, also the subtitles down here at the bottom of the graph. This one is a bit different from the typical bar charts. Usually, the x-axis shows the categories and the y-axis shows the numbers. But in this chart, the axes are switched. The y-axis represents the category and the x-axis represents number. Make sure to note the units of the measurement here. Percentages, not billions or millions. And always use the correct expression for percentages when reporting your results. Next, the categories shown are food, housing, fuel and power, clothing and footwear, and so on. There are quite a few categories to consider here. Now we have covered the units, the categories. Later we will cover the numbers in the graph. Step 3. Select the important information. So, how do we decide what information is most important? Here is a simple guide. First, identify the highest and the lowest points. In 1968, food had the highest value, while fuel and power had the lowest. In 2018, leisure reached the highest point, and fuel and personal goods had the lowest value. Second, check for decrease. The category that decreased are food, fuel and power, clothing, and personal goods. The biggest drop was in food. Third, check the increases. The categories that increases are housing, transport, leisure, and the biggest increase was in leisure. Fourth, stability in some categories. Some categories remained relatively stable, such as household goods. Simply select these points and jot them down in a list. We will then compare them in the planning stage. Stage 2. Planning your ideas. Planning is crucial. If you want to improve your writing speed, this stage is essential. Without planning, you will be forced to organize your ideas while writing, which will make the process slower and more difficult. So, don't skip the planning stage. This is your time to think and generate ideas. Writing is just for putting those ideas into words. Here is how to organize your writing. Introduction, overview, detail paragraph 1, detail paragraph 2. For introduction, the goal is to paraphrase the topic. For overview, you should describe the most obvious changes or trend in general. In detail paragraphs, you should compare the informations where relevant. Now, let's start with the introduction. The introduction is simple. Paraphrase the topic. You can include some basic information from the graph as well. Write down your plan with keywords. My plan will be intro, paraphrase the topic, and categories. Next, overview. In the overview, no need to include any detailed data here, just a 2-sentence will do. For bar charts, it's best to describe the changes across the different categories. This is what bar charts are made for. Let's refer to the list we just made. From my observation, the 2 biggest changes are in food and leisure, while few remain stable. I would highlight these points in my overview. Write the plan down. Overview. First, few remain stable. Second, food decreased the most, leisure increased the most. Let's move on to detailed paragraphs. Detailed paragraphs are for organizing data, but how? When working with bar charts, comparison is key. In my line graph tutorial, I suggested comparing points and trends sequentially across 2 paragraphs. This works well for line graphs, but for the bar charts, the approach is slightly different. You won't get lost in floods of data as long as you organize it clearly. For the detailed paragraphs, I recommend dividing your data by the direction of change. For example, detailed paragraph 1, focus on the categories that decrease. Here is how I'm going to write the plan. Detailed paragraph. First, food fell half. Second, clothing, personal good, lowest in 2018. Third, few, lowest and stable. Detail paragraph 2, focus on the categories that increased. Let's look at the graph. Don't compare them all in one sentence. My plan will be detail paragraph 2. First, housing, transport, leisure, doubled increase. Second, house and transport. Third, leisure. There is no need for a separate paragraph just to compare individual points. Instead, we can describe the changes in each category by focusing on increases and decreases. Remember, you must mention all the specific numbers, percentages in detailed paragraphs. Now our planning is down. We can elaborate our essay based on the plan. Write the essay. First, introduction paragraph. To begin, we will paraphrase the prompt. The original prompt is, the chart below gives information about how families in one country spent their weekly income in 1968 and 2018. We can complete this quickly using our 4 paraphrasing tips. If you are unfamiliar with them, be sure to check out my earlier videos. First, let's replace chart with bar chart to specify the type of graph. Second, change gives information to a stronger verb such as shows, illustrate, demonstrate, or indicates. Third, instead of repeating how families in one country spend their weekly income, we can paraphrase it as the expenditure patterns of families or use variations such as the distribution of weekly income among families, average family spending, or weekly family expenditures. To expand the introduction and provide a bit more detail, we can also mention the categories of spending. Here is my final version of the introduction. The bar chart illustrates the expenditure patterns of families in 1968 and 2018. It compares the percentage of weekly income allocated to various categories of spending, highlighting significant changes over the 50-year period. The second sentence is basically an introduction of the graph. Instead of listing all the categories' names, I use various categories. Next paragraph, the overview. Based on our planning, I will write the overview paragraph like this. Overall, the data reveals significant shifts in family expenditure over the half century, with certain trends such as low spending on fuel and clothing remained stable. Others, particularly in housing and leisure, underwent dramatic changes. Now let's break this paragraph down. First, the opening phrase. I always use phrases like overall. It is clear that, it is obvious that, to start my overview. It's a quickly way to introduce the general summary without overcomplicating things. Second, paraphrasing topic. Here, I have rephrased the topic how families spend their weekly income to shifts in family expenditure, which adds variety to the language. Third, specific categories without details. In this overview, I've mentioned the categories fuel, clothing, housing, and leisure, but without diving into exact figures. The goal here is to show the broad trends and indicate that we will discuss the specific data later. Now move on to detail paragraph 1. When writing about trends and percentages, using accurate expression is essential. I have created videos with advanced expressions for describing trends and percentages, so make sure you check them out. Sentence 1. The most notable decline in spending was observed in food expenditure, which fell sharply from 35% in 1968 to between 15% and 20% in 2018. First, the subject. You don't have to always start with decline. You can also begin with the category itself, like spending on food was significantly higher in 1968 at 35% compared to just 15 to 20% in 2018. And you can also say food expenditure dropped sharply from 35% in 1968 to about 70% in 2018. You have a lot of options. Next, the expression fell sharply is effective because it emphasizes a significant drop. As I discussed in my trend video, it's good to combine adverbs and adjectives with verbs to convey strengths in trends. Next, sentence 2. Other categories such as clothing and personal goods also experienced moderate reductions, maintaining relatively low expenditure levels of 5%, while fuel and power costs remained the least prioritized items in both years, accounted for 4% to 6%. First, the conjunction while is useful to connect two ideas in one sentence. It helps combine information effectively. You must use it as much as you can. Then prioritize is a useful term for writing tasks. Like spending on leisure was prioritized in 2018. In the detail paragraphs, always include specific figures for each category to ensure clarity and precision. Now, detail paragraph 2. Conversely, the most striking increases in expenditure occurred in the housing and leisure sectors. Conversely, helps to show the contrast between the two detail paragraphs, emphasizing the increase after discussing the decline in previous paragraph. And I changed the significant to striking for variation in language. You can also change the subject to suit your needs. For example, spending on housing and leisure saw the most notable increase. Sentence 2. In 2018, families allocated almost 20% of their weekly income to housing and 40% to transportation, marking a sharp rise from approximately half of those percentages in 1968. You could also phrase this like, this marked a doubling from 10% in 1968 to 20% in 2018. For comparisons like this, check out my video on expressing percentages. Sentence 3. Similarly, spending on leisure activities saw a substantial boost, rising by approximately 50% over the past 5 decades. Here, saw a substantial boost is a good pattern to use for describing significant changes. Although I usually don't include a conclusion for Task 1 essays. It's entirely optional and depends on your preference. If you want to wrap up your essay, you could summarize the key traits briefly. Now the essay is finished. More than 150 words will be enough. Last but not least, let's go over the essay together. First, let's check the topic. We have used variations like weekly expenditure patterns of families, weekly income allocation, and weekly spending. These all reflect the same idea but in different ways, which helps make the language more varied. Next, let's look at the expression for proportions. We have used terms like from 35%, between 15% and 20%, of 5%, for 4% to 6%, 20% of, 14%, and by 15%. Effectively, be sure to check out my dedicated video on this topic. Now let's review the time expression. We have used phrases like over the 50 years period, over the past half century, over the past 5 decades. These all convey the same ideas, but add variety and clarity when referring to the time frame. Finally, let's go over some train descriptions. We have used expressions like underwent dramatic changes, experienced a significant decline, fell sharply, experienced moderate decreases, marked a sharp rise, and soaring by approximately 10%. These are great ways to describe trend and add variety to your writing to show the examiner your vocabulary. That's all for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. I highly recommend you check out my videos on line graphs and maps for more tips and tricks. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. See you in the next video. Bye bye.